Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Bavarian and this is Victoria 3's 6th Dev Diary. I am late because my internet went out, much like the internet of many people that are customers of my ISP in South Germany. It was a pain, but we're back and so is ModCon. That's gonna happen tonight with the very first day, so I'm excited for that. But let's jump into this Dev Diary. This one is about interest groups, very interesting. There has been a hot debate on this topic because of course what they didn't plan with originally is to have any sort of party representation in democracies in Victoria 3, because interest groups sort of already do that, although of course an interest group is not a party per se, meaning that there is a bit of a dissonance, there's a disconnect between the interest groups and the actual political day-to-day life for the people in Victoria 3's era, once they, transition to something that has voting to begin with. Now, this is a great Dev Diary. There's a lot of information in here, and it's going to take us some time. Since I am one day late, there are so many Dev Diary answers from devs that, well, we're going to take a look at all of those. It's going to be quite the work through. Interest groups, which form the nucleus of Victoria 3's political gameplay. Fundamentally, an interest group is a collection of pops that espouse certain political views and want to change the country to be more in line with those views. Interest groups are drawn from a number of different templates, but will vary in their exact views from country to country, based on factors such as the local religion, which social movements have appeared in the country, or the personal views of their leader. So this is interesting, because you're looking at something that this differs from Victoria 2 categorically in several ways. Primarily, what I want to point out is that, first of all, the leader has a big impact, and there is something to debate here. We're going to take a look at that once we get to the leader, related to the great man theory. It might tell you something, it might not tell you something. I want to get to that in a second. And then on the other hand, there is also the influence that if you play a different country, the politics and the policies that the interest groups want are actually different compared to a different country that you played earlier. For example, the Anglican Church is directly integrated into, the United Kingdom, or rather Great Britain as a state, whereas, for example, if you go to China, if you go to Japan, it has a very different relationship in relation to what makes up the state to begin with. So that is something that is interesting, because it should bring variety, and I hope that that is properly reflected. Now, when it comes to the social movements and how they, influence the interest groups, we sadly don't know any of the math, we don't know any of the specifics behind it, but again, that is of course something that is very important for a game like Victoria 3. Your politics are determined by what is going on, whether the wealth, whether your industry actually works for everybody, whether there is a wealth distribution that makes it so that everybody is happy, or that, not necessarily everybody is happy. So these sort of circumstances are very interesting and very important to keep track of, and I'm a big fan of them actually saying, hey, your interest groups in 1836 will not be the same, or rather, they may be the same, but they will have different policies, because times change. I think that is very important. Again, huge fan right from the get-go. The landowners is an interest group dominated by the aristocracy and tends to be firmly in the conservative side of politics. Of course, that makes a lot of sense. Those are the echelons, or those are the higher echelons of society. We can see Friedrich August von Giese right here. This is actually the historical Bavarian, let's call it chancellor, maybe prime minister, maybe minister just in general. He was right there in 1836, I think, until 1841 or 42. So this is Bavaria. Thank you, Wiz, by the way. What we have here is they are in government, it seems. They can be suppressed, they can be promoted, and I think that this means have them join the government or remove them from the government. You can see their icon right here, then their ideologies. I am not sure about the coloring. That is something that I've actually looked into, or rather thought about a lot, and I can't really make sense of it. I assume that they are basically ambivalent to slavery. There is no slavery at the time, serfdom, of course, in Bavaria, but there is no slavery, and that means that they basically don't care about your politics related to that, because they don't have slavery. And then this, on the other hand, is red, but they appear to be something like primary issues, right? This is maybe the man is the head of the family, this might be the social hierarchy in general, and this might just be that the man in society is also the head of society, but I don't know, this kind of doubles up if that is the explanation, so I'm not entirely sure what they mean. Now you can see the clout right here and how much they approve, and then the traits are interesting, because apparently these are basically bonuses if you get them to like you. We're going to get to that in a second as well. Now the interesting thing here, and I want to point that out, as that is something that, I've sort of cut into in the intro segment of this video. So this leader has positions that are his ideologies, and they are not necessarily the same as the ideologies of, for example, the position of the party. I think this is like the only ideology. I believe this is basically his character traits. So I assume this is maybe he's like good as masquerading. He is somebody that was said to be excellent at basically court politics, then maybe ambitious, and maybe the state needs to grow, you know, something like that anyway. They're also differently colored, but again, we don't really know the answer. Now, the thing that I want to mention here is, in the great man theory, that was very prevalent in the 19th and 20th century until after World War II, basically, we're looking at a theory that says that great men, or great people in general, basically shape the history and the fate of a society. Now, this has been debunked in many, many ways. I mean, in basically infinite ways, because the great men, or the great personnel that is being used for this example, like Napoleon, like Caesar, you know, all of that, Kaiser, like all that stuff, is basically something that was formed by society. Meaning, the great man is not so much something that propels society into a different state, but rather society propels the man into a state where it can then, yet again, reform society into a different situation, you know, depending on the needs, depending on how they grew up and so on. I have heard criticism of party leaders and of government leaders being very important, playing important roles, and yet again it has been confirmed, of course, that party leaders they are randomly generated, they can influence the ideology of the actual group that they had. So this is the leader, let's say, if he was pro-slavery, then in some way, I don't know exactly how it would work, because they haven't explained that, but in some way he might be able to make the landowners pro-slavery, and that is weird, right? Because it sounds like great man theory, but I want to categorically disagree. I don't think that that is what it means. I think I would interpret it in a different way, that a faction of this interest group has taken control of the interest group, and if the leader is strong enough, if the leader propels the interest group to success, then that might mean that the ideology of the interest group changes. What I am interested in is whether the ideology of the leader has an influence on how you can make the interest group happy, or whether it is just there to say the interest group might change to this new ideologies. So for example, if he has something that goes against the current interest group of the interest group's ideology, it might mean that we can then go, hey, I'm going to do what this guy says, and that means the interest group, despite me technically going against them, is still happy, because Friedrich, you know, he keeps everybody basically very, very quiet about it. That is something that I'm thinking about. I wonder what you think when it comes to the leaders. I honestly, I see the concern for the great man theory, and I don't think that a game about pops should ever focus too much on characters. I think the character focus that we're seeing here is fine. I would just simply suggest that the leader of an interest group is not to be interpreted as a great man, so to speak, but rather as something that is basically the shift inside of the power factions of the interest group itself, and that has not been yet reflected in the actual ideologies. So, you know, if you were to disagree with the ideologies of the landowners, then that just means that the shift towards this new ideology is still undergoing the power struggle. That is anyway how I interpret that. Now, they are randomly generated. We're going to get to that with a dev comment later, so let's skip over that. You can see it right here. The aristocrats and the clergymen, and they are prosperous, they are middling. That is basically who is, you know, a part of the interest group. As mentioned, interest groups are fundamentally made up of pops. All individuals and all pops are either members of an interest group or politically inactive, with a ratio in each based on factors such as profession, wealth, literacy, etc. So this is basically a further developed system that already existed in Victoria too. Of course, you know, even if you have the right to vote, if you might not care to vote, kids, make sure that once you're old enough to vote, go vote. It's very important in the real world. But what I'm saying is that, of course, there are pops that, you know, say, hey, I don't really care for this. You know, maybe they're happy enough. Maybe they want to see change. Maybe they just don't know how it actually works, because, again, the literacy might be too low. Maybe, you know, they're just really disinterested in it. Or maybe they are, yet again, disenfranchised if they are not politically inactive. So this is determined, basically, you can say, hey, and this is also yet again another nice influence there. You can say, I'm going to influence especially this region right here, let's say the Rhineland, for example, where there are a lot of people actually working in the industry. I'm going to give them wealth, I'm going to give them literacy so that they become politically active, and then either decide for the side that I want. So, for example, let's say the communists. If you want a communist rebellion so that you can take over, then that is what you could do. Or you say, hey, I'm going to feed them very, very well so that they say, hey, I don't need to rebel, I am happy, right? So I can simply be the person that I want to be by being conservative. You know, that sort of stuff is, of course, something that we can then influence on a very tiny level, on a very micro scale, basically, and I like that a lot. I think this is the right decision here in terms of what influences whether they are active and what sort of interest group they want to join. Individuals inside pops contribute political strength to their interest group of choice with the amount of amount they contribute, again, dependent on multiple factors, the main ones being the material wealth and the status and or votes they are offered under the nation's power structure. So this is another thing. Every pop, or rather every individual inside of a pop, let's say a pop is like 1,000 people, every individual has to decide, if they are politically active, on what interest group they want to focus on. So what their main interest group is. Now, every individual, of course, has different influences, that sort of take care of that say, hey, this is what you care for, this is what you don't care for, and now go and choose an interest group. I actually got a Reddit chat message. I've never used Reddit chat. I didn't know there was a feature, but I got a Reddit chat message that said, a bit disappointed that basically we're looking at something where every pop can only be limited to one interest group. In Democracy 4, for example, you have a situation where every pop has a percentage leaning towards something. And I can see where this is coming from, but I think there's and I don't disagree necessarily. I think having more changes would be nice, but there is actually a really good dev answer in this thread that basically reads, well, on a realistic impact level, if you have 1,000 people in one pop, and these 1,000 individuals have 150 of them that go and say, I support the landowners, that is equal to one pop supporting the landowners with 15%. Right? You get where I'm coming from? The result is the exact same. I agree. I think this is mostly game mechanics in terms of what is better for the programmers, what is better for the game design flow, maybe even what is better for optimization. I think that it works out to the same result. Yeah, so just to address that, basically, I really wanted to put that in there to say, hey, at the end of the day, whether you have 15% in one person or 15% of all people, but all people, that are these 15% have to support them 100%, it doesn't really make a difference in the actual outcome. And I do think that there is a bit of a misconception. While they are more modular, it seems, than pops in Victoria 2, I will argue that we should still see pops as a grouping of people. I don't think we should go down to the individual level, or rather, I would be nice, right? But I don't think Victoria 3 does that. I think they will still act primarily out of their pop sort of location, and then, one pop can be split into 15% landowners, etc., etc. Instead of being like, one individual can't be split. Of course they can't be, because the game primarily functions on the actual pop level. Now, with that tangent done, for example, a single wealthy aristocrat in an oligarchy will provide hundreds or even 1,000 times the political strength of a poor laborer. The total political strength of all pops in an interest group is what gives its level of clout, the amount of political weight it can assert on the country and the government. Pops are not unified in which interest groups they support. Again, of course, we talked about that just now. Individuals within pops are the ones who decide their interest group, and a single pop can potentially have individuals supporting every interest group in the game in different numbers. That is absolutely great. Also a step up from Victoria 2, of course, but at the end of the day, you still should look at the pop and then see what the percentages are there, because again, an individual has to decide on an interest group. Some pops have no political strength at all, usually due to being disenfranchised under the nation's laws, such as people of religion or culture that is discriminated against, or women in countries that haven't instituted women's suffrage. Suffrage. Very nice. Yeah, of course, that's going to be very important in the time period of Victoria 3. These pops are outside the system, so to speak, unable to demand reform through the regular political system of interest groups, and instead having to rely on other methods to put pressure on the government, but we won't focus on those today. I'm really interested in how that works. That's a big topic. How can the disenfranchised, the truly disenfranchised, how can they influence it? The first, answer is, of course, rebellion. Yeah, quite frankly, I don't like rebellions in video games, in grand strategy games in particular, because most rebellions, especially the ones of the Victoria 2 pops, oh my god, they're just you stomping enemies, right? It's bad design. It's really bad design. You let them win if you want them to win, and otherwise you just tell your army, hey, clean that up. I think it's terrible. Listen, EU4. EU4 is a beloved game, and rightfully so, but my god, are the rebellions annoying or what? They will also talk about it later, actually, that, civil wars are an option, so having a distinction there, which Victoria 2 didn't have, except for the Americans, I guess. Having a distinction between a civil war and a rebellion, I think, might be quite interesting, but I hope that there will be more soft power approaches as well. I don't know. Assassinations of important politicians, assassinations of the ruling family, maybe, something like the rebellion that happened in, what's it called, Kronstadt, right? The rebellion in Russia that happened after the communists took over or were about to take over. Oh my god, I can't even remember. Where the sailors rebelled, right? Because that is a highly localized, more event-based, I guess, rebellion, rather than this, hey, your Jacobins have risen up, and you just see all these tiny stacks everywhere. It's a pain in the behind, so let's hope that they find a better solution there, but we don't know anything about that yet. Now here we have a beautiful map. I will tell you right now, I think the Victoria 3 paper map fits exactly what Victoria 2 tried to capture, except more modern. I think these must be trade routes, right? We've talked about this. I've talked about this before in different circumstances, but these must be paper maps right there. Svealand, Swedish, Protestant. Status looks good, whatever the hell that means. Maybe it is maybe that means that it is a core territory. Then growth, okay, so it's growing. Literacy is 90%. Radicals 0, loyalists 0. So radicals are if you basically take away the happiness of a pop, that they become angry and want to destroy you, and then loyalists are the exact opposite. Wealth is 20. Don't know whether that's good or bad. Standard of living is secure. That's nice. Net income, okay. Primary primary interest group actually. Oh, there you go. So we're looking at a pop, right? This is one pop that is growing here, and they are primarily industrialists, yeah. And then the political strength is 20.6k. Now, as you can see, the membership is determined right here. 756 are members of the industrialists, so attraction is currently 59%, so 59% of the pop will go into this. Then 402 people are petite bourgeoisie, 165 are intelligentsia, and 58 are the Church of Sweden. That is fairly small, but could still be very powerful depending on whether these are all the rich people going there. But I assume that all of these seem quite rich. I don't know what pop type this is, but it certainly sounds like aristocrat. Could it be a capitalist? Could it be a shopkeeper, maybe? It doesn't sound like they are poor. Let's just phrase it like this. They are politically inactive pops, so they just don't care enough. There's always a percentage that doesn't care unless they have what was called consciousness in Victoria 2. And then there are 3.49k pops that are disenfranchised dependent, so children, women in this case, I'm sure, because this is obviously 1836, as you can see here by Norway and Sweden being joined together. So yeah, this is quite interesting, and the fact that they are split right here, again, you don't look at the individuals, you just look at the individuals in which way the pops split up. I like this a lot. This is very, very nice. This is much more dynamic, this is much more aggressive when it comes to making it so that there will be an impact for every action you take, because that could even mean that somebody gets politically active, it could mean that they join a different interest group, and all of a sudden this shift maybe from the industrialists goes all to the petite bourgeoisie. I think that it's a good system. I really like what we're seeing here so far with the interest groups. Again, there's this issue with the parties, but that is addressed later as well. As mentioned above, interest groups have a number of ideologies which determine their view on which laws the country should or should not enact. Different interest groups will have a different ideology. The landowners are significantly more conservative than the trade unions, for example. Shocking, I know, but these are not entirely set in stone. They can change over the course of the game and will also vary based on the current leader of the interest group, who comes with his or her own personal ideology and view of the world. I want to point this out again. He seems to come with one ideology, which is really weird, because this is like, why is his main ideology slavery? I am ambivalent towards that. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I also, honestly, looking at this, right, I was thinking that this might mean these are not fulfilled, so they're against it, and this is fulfilled because they don't care about slavery, right? But I can't, no, in 1836 in Bavaria, the social hierarchy is most certainly exactly what the landowners wanted, so yeah, I still not sure about the coloring. If you have any ideas, do let me know, though. And we were right here. But these are not entirely set in stone, right? They can change based on the events and based on the leader. Additionally, some interest groups in certain countries have unique ideologies colored by their religion and culture, such as the Confucian School interest group in Qingchina, who unsurprisingly espouse a Confucian ideology. That makes a lot of sense. Here we have the Anglican Church, and they have a stance on church and state. They hate to have laïcité, so total separation. They like freedom of conscience, and they would love if they were the state religion. I wonder, I mean, you will have to choose, right? Could I just go and, like, let's say in, I don't know, in Lithuania, I set state religion. Do I get to choose which religion? I should, right? I should most certainly get or have to choose. Could I just be like, I don't know, it's Confucianism now. Would be interesting. And then they also have a stance on education systems, so that means disapproves of public schools and private schools. They are neutral towards no schools, keep them stupid, or they approve of religious schools. It is a pro-state religion, of course. This is this very much right here. So this actually, and this is interesting, one ideology has an impact on two different sets of policies. I like that. I like that a lot. It makes it so that you may have three ideologies here, but at the same time, you have multiple policies in there, so maybe 6, maybe 7, maybe 8 policies that are impacted by this, making it so that basically any policy you do or you enact or you take out again is impacted by how your interest groups feel about it. Clout is calculated by comparing the political strength to that of the other interest groups. Of course, it's a cake, so basically, or it's a pie, you could say. A pie chart. If you have 100k political strength and somebody has 30k, then they have 30% clout. This one has 12.9% clout, because that's just the way it is. The interest group's clout will determine their classification: powerful, influential, or marginalized. Interest groups also have a level of approval, which is based on factors such as how much they approve of the country's laws, whether they are in government or in opposition, and how many of their individual members are loyalists or radicals. More on those in a later dev diary. There are numerous other factors that can affect approval as well, such as how you react to certain events or decisions that you take. Very cool. Again, approval, very, very important. You don't need approval from a marginalized group. Of course, they're very unimportant, but you will need approval even if they're not in government from a group that, you know, for example, has like 12.9% strength. That is quite impactful, I think. The approval we actually saw up here. There it is. Yeah, that's the approval. So, together the classification and approval of an interest group determine which traits are active for an interest group at any given time and how impactful they are. There are different traits, positive and negative, with positive traits being activated when an interest group is happy and negative ones when they are not so happy. If an interest group is powerful, the effects of any trait they have active, good or bad, are stronger, while an interest group that is marginalized cannot activate traits at all, as they are too weak to exert an effect on the whole country. So what we have right here are these different effects. They're not marked as negative and or positive. These are in different colors, but again, we can't really tell. None of these are currently active. We see this one actually activated down here. Look at that. Noblesse oblige. You can see it right here. It's green, so that is most certainly a good one. Plus 20% aristocrats investment pool contribution, since this interest group is powerful, so 23%. Their interest group traits have a plus 100% stronger effect. That is really, really neat. So I assume basically, if you are powerful, then you get a plus 100% effect. If you are, where's the other rest? If you are influential, then it's just the normal effect, and marginalized basically minus 100%, so nothing at all. That can't be activated to begin with, as you can see right here. We're better than the common folk, which means we have a duty to care for them. I don't want to do any commentary, but that is so... This is classic Bavarian conservatism. Their attempts to organize things for themselves are self-destructive and doomed to failure. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not going to comment on that. Political parties and whether they will be a part of Victoria 3, so I want to briefly touch on this. Right, let's talk about political parties. What I can tell you for now is that we are currently looking into a solution where parties can form in certain countries as constellations of interest groups holding a shared political platform. And that is interesting. It's also very complex, because it means that either the interest groups are identical, in which case they can form parties, or it has to be with compromises. And it would be cool to possibly, once you have a democratic representation via parties, just have every interest group translate into a political party, and if their ideology matches well enough, and I say well enough because it's a compromise, again, well enough with another interest group's party, they can just fuse, I think that would be nice, but I think this is also a highly complex system. Adding another layer between the pops and the interest groups and what you actually get as, political representation is very difficult, because it could just mangle what already exists in how you can influence interest groups. I hope that they do this well here. Political parties are going to be difficult, but they have to be in. Let's be real here. This is something that by no means fully nailed is by no means fully nailed down at this point, though. So don't take this as a 100% firm commitment to how they would function. What I can tell you for sure is that we will come back to this particular topic later. Now, they are taking a break from Dev Diaries until the July 22nd, so that's the next date, and they will be talking about the subject of laws. Again, this is a very interesting Dev Diary. I addressed the topic of the great man theory. I don't think that this applies here. I saw some criticism again, because this is fundamentally a game about population and the impact that economy and war have on the population, but I also do think that this is basically just another way of showing that there are different factions inside an interest group that might be fighting to change things. Now, the fact that this is completely randomly generated, I mean, I do hope at the very least that the player has some sort of influence whether an interest group takes some stuff over. Not complete control, mind you. Interest groups need to be independent to make it interesting, but I hope that there is some interaction here that goes further than just saying, hey, the landowners might become, I don't know, communists tomorrow. Now, let's move on to the section of the Dev Diary answers. Does the blue ideology indicate the personal ideology of the interest group leader? Oh. That's so silly. Wait a minute. So this was actually added. I marked it and I didn't understand this context. My apologies. This was actually added because of the leader, rather than the leader just happened to add to this. But that means that the leader can't ever possibly be against this, doesn't it? Right, so the leaders appear to be adding things rather than properly altering things. See, I would really like it if the leader actually had potential to say, hey, I would like to shift this ideology or this interest group to a different ideology, but this appears to be what it means, so this is just added, and once Friedrich is gone, that just means this disappeared and something else appears in its place, depending on what the character is. I hope that theoretically... Is he a slaver? It's no way, right? I hope that theoretically this can become red, basically, right? If the leader is very influential, if the landowners are very successful, that the leader can have a lasting impact as their faction had control of the interest group. So, for example, this can stay and, I don't know, this gets kicked out. But we'll learn about that more later, I'm sure. The armed forces' typical ideologies favor laws that help sustain a strong national defense and keep the populace loyal, but it's entirely possible for the armed force to gain a leader that has a different ideological bent. In that case, you can indeed end up with an armed force that is strongly pro-communist, which may be beneficial or problematic for you. See, so it's basically self-sustenance that the armed forces are focused on. I just really hope, I mean, man, this is honestly difficult. I really wish, though, that... I have to assume that the random number generation behind a leader being selected is based on the pops and their ideologies as they join an interest group. If you have 50% communists in the armed forces because they are pro-military, for example, which, I mean, yeah, exists, right? Then that could mean that you constantly have a high chance of basically getting pro-communism armed forces leaders because they are recruited from that pool. Meaning that this is just another reflection of the pops in the leaders. I think, I feel that's actually how it works. I'm gonna tweet Martin about this. But yeah, I think this is actually how it is. While each individual pop within it, yeah, this is what I mentioned, you know, it's just the 15% of the pop. You can either say that every person in that pop leans 15% towards the ideology, or you can say, hey, it's just 150 people properly committing to that. It doesn't actually make a difference in terms of gameplay. How do the views of an IG change? Outside of major events, yes, leaders are randomly generated, but this is strongly influenced by the interest group in question and the state of your country. You might end up with an abolitionist as the country's religious leader, and this might be much more likely depending on what your state religion is, while you're not going to get an anarchist leader of the armed forces. So it has been... you can see it basically here. You can pick your state religion. Very cool. Very good stuff. Well, you're not going to get an anarchist leader of the armed forces. Why not? There's been armed forces that were anarchists. Think of the... this is not political commentary, but the anarchist commune in Catalonia at the time of the Spanish Civil War. They still had armed forces, you know, to a degree. Interesting anyway. I wonder how that is actually influenced. Man, I really wonder how the leaders are calculated. Definitely. Can different interest groups potentially overlap on certain ideologies? Definitely. There are many cases where interest groups both share ideologies. The armed forces and petite bourgeoisie are both patriotic, for example, and where the interest groups' ideologies make them ideological allies for the purpose of changing a certain law but not another. For example, the intelligentsia would rather have religious schools than no schools, and so would the devout, but once enacted, the intelligentsia would usually prefer a more secular school system, while the devout would loathe dismantling religion schools in favor of some other flavor, and would rather get rid of organized education altogether. Right, this is actually interesting. We're looking at a situation where they can overlap, but with different end goals. I think that is quite neat. It will allow you to have policies, you know, pass without really screwing around with the people that you care for, but, you know, in the end, they might actually have different end goals. Yeah, I'm a big fan of that. I would like to ask whether elections will be in the game, and if so, how will they be implemented? Elections will be in the game for sure. We will cover the mechanics of those in a separate dev diary, but for now I can say that while non-democratic systems tend to experience political shifts gradually, as pops change and update their preferences in response to mostly economic forces, elections will have the possibility to be major turning points for a country, as mass political strength is redistributed all at once. They also tend to, but don't have to, grant a relatively more political strength to their lower class, which shifts the political balance of power. Of course, you can have voting, but also it might be based on your wealth, you know? Classic stuff. Classic German emperor time. What happened when women's suffrage occurs? Is it simply a dependence decrease and an increase in that affected pop's social consciousness? More dependents get to cast a vote, which makes the piece of the political strength pie made up of votes even larger, of course. This in turn tends to grant more political strength to the common folk. Fully moddable? Yep. Wonderful. There's no such thing as a good pie chart. Yes, we have pie charts. Good news. So, pie charts are awful to read, period, but pie charts in Victoria 2 give you the feeling, it's the Victoria feeling. So, having pie charts, great news. Absolutely. Are you able to confirm whether you are able to remain as conservative religious country throughout the game, or is it inevitable that you shift away from piety and conservatism towards liberalism? You definitely can. One of the design pillars of Victoria 3 was to not treat liberalism as an inevitable progression, but rather something that emerges organically from your actions, and which you could try to hold back, or encourage, or revert. There are certainly forces, mostly economic in the world, that encourage the trend towards liberalism, but you can try to build a perfect, pious, agrarian society if you so wish. To try to address a couple of other questions all at once, interest groups only represent the conventional political forces in your country, those who could at least be marginally heard in the halls of power. While they can rebel against the government if they dislike where the country is going, not all rebellious forces in your country are represented by interest groups. So in this case, of cultural nationalists, secessionists, minority religious groups, colonial subjects, and other pops who are systemically disenfranchised in the country, there are other, usually more direct ways in which they can influence you. Again, I wish we knew the more direct ways. If it's just rebellion, then I'm not going to be happy about it. But I have a feeling that it is not just rebellion. Now, let's take a look at this. Can laws affect the power and attraction of IGs? So if you have a trade unions banned or just a single state-controlled trade union, would they have less influence in your politics? Yes. For example, religious schools increases devout pop attraction. That is nice. It gives you a way to interact with your pops outside of the economic circumstances that they have and just say, hey, we're going to send you to religious groups, because of course it makes it so that you're going to become more devout than otherwise possible. On this subject, is it possible with a sufficiently homogeneous and pious population to get just as much benefit out of religious schools as out of public schools? Or will public schools be more expensive but ultimately superior to religious schools in every instance? Public schools will provide more literacy, be more expensive, but there are more side effects like devout attraction, IG approval, etc. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. How different will the desires of different IGs be from country to country? For example, historically, southern aristocrats in the US supported slavery, whereas British aristocrats generally did not, and vice versa with having a monarch. Can these changes over time, for example, would a monarchist USA eventually be able to create pro-monarchist aristocrats? Will we have the same interest groups regardless of government? For example, will they still have the landowner IG in a communist country? This is a good answer. Let's go through it. While interest groups in all countries follow the same broad templates, there can be local variations. From your example, the US variant on the landowners, southern planters, do support slavery, while in other countries where slavery has already been abolished, the landowners tend to be ambivalent to it. Man, I really have to ask, does he support slavery? Does he? I'm so confused. Tend to be ambivalent to it. In some countries, they might even oppose it as uncouth and barbaric. However, while it is possible for interest group types to differ from country to country, and for interest group ideologies to change in response to events or temporarily, along with the leaders. So it's only temporary? Come on. It's so boring. The extent by which this happens is fairly limited. I wish they could have an influence there, just a power shift in the ideology. For the political system to be interesting to engage with, the ideologies of each group have to be balanced such that by default any given law will please some groups and anger others. Yeah, this is very vital. I completely agree with this. If the groups stray too far from their molds, then a subset of the laws could become uninteresting to try to pass, and if the interest groups were to change their ideologies too frequently, it'd be hard to get a handle on what they stand for and what role they play. All of this is correct. From a game design point of view, you want clarity there because this is a very complex system, and to have it depicted in a way where you know what pleases one faction and what displeases another, makes it so that you can actually interact with the system. If it changes too often, it could be difficult, but I will say again, if you keep planters happy, for example, if you subsidize their plants even without slavery, why wouldn't they shift away from slavery, right? Like, it's a difficult one. I get where Lacek is coming from here. I understand that, and I think it's good game design, no doubt. But I think from a roleplay perspective, I would like it if you could have basically a transition where you just, take away the slavery as a requirement for the landowners to be wealthy by subsidizing them with, for example, the industrial gains made in the north of America. Yeah, that's basically my stance on it. I agree on a design level. I'm not sure about a roleplay level. Government form, or rather the legal implications of the government form, can have a huge impact on interest groups' power. To use your example, in a communist country, private ownership is abolished, which alters the ownership production method of buildings. We talked about that last week. This in turn effectively abolishes both capitalism and the aristocracy, which devastates the power base of the industrialists and landowners respectively, because those are the members of those factions. So after a communist government form has been instituted, there may still be some holdouts to support the old ways, but it's likely these interest groups will become marginalized in favor of more powerful trade unions, intelligentsia, and rural folk. So while the vestige of the interest group will remain and will re-emerge if conditions change, it will be rendered irrelevant without a power base. I guess that this is the response to my roleplay concerns, because this basically says the interest group doesn't change, the interest group becomes marginalized and with that irrelevant, but the pops will simply funnel themselves into new, equally as powerful interest groups. I feel like that might be what we're talking about here. So even a soft transition away from slavery may dismantle the old class of landowners, you know, the old class of the landholding group, but it may introduce a new ideology with the old one becoming marginalized because their pro-slavery stances are simply too old-fashioned. That is actually an interesting idea. Instead of changing interest groups internally, you simply get rid of an interest group. You add a different one. I think that could make a lot of sense. You know what? Lacek, you got me. You got me. Well, I guess the follow-up question will be, can you have a conservative religious society while industrialized? Yes, but it's harder. A more industrialized economy requires a more educated workforce, and a more literate population is both more likely to get involved with politics and also more likely to support interest groups that demand liberal reforms like voting rights and free speech, because of course they're not rich, they're not part of the upper echelons of the church, so they want to have their own voting rights. One way to try to play this is to try to max out on authority, so you can try to keep the sentiments under control. If one of these movements should boil over, you can put it back down with a powerful military. Another strategy, if you have a lot of workforce at your disposal, is to not modernize your factories, instead relying on large quantities of poorly educated laborers rather than mechanists and engineers. The former tend to be less politically engaged in the first place and also have less political strength on account of their low incomes. Quite interesting. Yeah, it will of course primarily be about maintaining your authoritative society and your style of governance, so that requires you to be authoritative, you know, that's exactly what it is. The idea of a direct election where you can count pops votes rather than use clout to calculate the more devious and bureaucratic ways groups can influence elections, but also the ruling coalitions those develop, seems short-sighted. It's both. While the precise mechanics of elections around how votes are counted and what role parties will play, if any, is something we're not quite yet ready to talk about, one thing that is not under discussion is that both political strength derived from pop wealth, as well as votes cast in democratic elections, will definitely count towards the effective political influence each power bloc will have. In addition, political strength can be affected by laws, for example monarchy giving more power to the landowners, and even things like geography. Pops in the capital to get a bonus to their political strength compared to pops who live elsewhere, while pops in unincorporated states like colonies get much less. So no, we're definitely not presenting an idealized version of how democracy magically creates perfectly equitable distribution of power due to one man, one vote, but we also want elections to act as important events where it's entirely possible that the balance of power suddenly shifts overnight due to powerful popular movements, public sentiment, or voter manipulation. Ooh, voter manipulation. I mean, it seems to be a bit abstracted, where basically if you have wealth, even if it is one man, one vote, you will have a higher input on the election outcome because you can influence things with your wealth. Yeah. This is a great approach. It is very nice to see that the devs are aware of the fact that elections aren't that simple, that you can't just go, hey, this is just how it comes out every time now, and you need to fundamentally change the ideology of a character or of a pop if you go on and want to change a society and a democracy. I think that is quite interesting. I think it makes it so that you can have potential there to really do see your country devolve into something, or evolve into something entirely different if you have elections happen and people just pivot very, very heavily on one or two topics, you know, the primary core topics, for example, as it happened in Victoria 2. How that actually plays out, we don't know, so we'll have to wait that out. But this is it for this dev diary. My god, 39 minutes. Jesus Christ. Thank you for tuning in. I will see you when the next dev diary hits, or tonight at ModCon, live on this channel, 6 PM CEST.